The era of machine politics controlling American cities lasted for some 150 years. These powerful political machines used patronage to create loyal blocks of voters that gave a virtual stranglehold on power. Perhaps the most notorious example was New York's Tammany Hall and its most notorious leader, William Tweed. But after more than a decade of power and personal enrichment, Boss Tweed was finally brought down, convicted in trial of embezzlement. And on December 4th, 1875, the 280-pound politician managed yet one more crime. He engineered a jailbreak. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The idea of machine politics, which dictionary.com defines as an administration of elected public officials who use their influential positions to solidify and perpetuate the power of their political party, often through dubious means, is as old as politics. But the term generally refers to a development in cities in the United States that dominated politics from the early 19th century to the middle 20th century. The American political machines depended upon patronage, the use of favors, to maintain loyalty among large voting blocs. The machines were characterized by bossism, the concentration of power in the hands of a few. Machines rose throughout the country. Joseph D. Reed of the University of Chicago and Michael M. Kurth of McNeese State University wrote in 1992, in most years between 1865 and 1930, patronage machines ruled many large cities: St. Louis, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and many smaller cities and towns too. While machine politics is often associated with graft, it is actually more complex than that. In many ways, the machines were a natural development of the nature of growth in America. Journalist and historian William Shannon wrote in American Heritage in 1969, "The new urban communities did not grow slowly and according to plan. On the contrary, huge conglomerates of people from all over the world and from widely varying backgrounds came together suddenly and in unplanned, unorganized fashion, fumbling their way towards communal relationships and a common identity. The political bosses emerged to cope with this chaotic change and growth." But that's not to say that the machines were not associated with graft, as of course they were. Shannon continues, acting out of greed, a ruthless will for mastery, and an imperfect understanding of what they were about, the bosses imposed upon these conglomerations called cities a certain feudal order and direction. But the machines also provided real services and presided over important public works projects, a mixed legacy that can be seen in the history of New York's Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was originally created as part of a broader Tammany movement. The Tammanies were secret societies, somewhat similar to Masonic lodges, founded on the principles of a 17th century Lenape leader named Tammany, who was renowned for his wisdom. What was likely the first lodge was established in Philadelphia in 1772. These lodges revered Native American culture, or at least Native American culture as they understood it, and mirrored Native American structures and costumes in their rituals, structures, and titles, going so far as to call their lodges wigwams. The New York Tammany Society was formed in May of 1789. The website ThoughtCo explains, in the years following the American Revolution, such organizations were commonplace in American cities. But the wigwam, whose leader carried the title Grand Sachem, was not just a social club. From the outset, its constitution defined it as a political institution founded on strong Republican basis. The society quickly became a force in democratic politics. In the election of 1800, Aaron Burr used Tammany Hall to counter Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. Some historians argue that it was the Tammany influence that swung the New York vote and delegates in that election, resulting in the defeat of John Adams' bid for re-election. Eventually, the Tammany organization came to represent Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. But Tammany struggled through the first half of the 19th century with other organizations, opposing Federalists and then Whigs, and often on the losing side. Ironically, as the Tammany organization was founded as a society of pure Americans who opposed immigration, they eventually gained dominance by embracing the growing number of Irish immigrants in the city. The Eleanor Roosevelt's Paper Project explains, throughout the 1830s and 1840s, the society expanded its political control even further by earning the loyalty of the city's ever-expanding immigrant community, a task that was accomplished by helping newly arrived foreigners obtain jobs, a place to live, and even citizenship so that they could vote for Tammany candidates in city and state elections. It was through this growing immigrant, particularly Irish support, that Tammany Hall first took control of city politics with the election of their Grand Sachem, Fernando Wood, as mayor of New York in 1854. Tammany Hall would dominate city politics for the next century. But Tammany Hall was, perhaps, most notorious under the man who replaced Wood as Grand Sachem in 1858, William Tweed. The son of a furniture maker, Tweed had natural talent in politics and was recruited into the Tammany organization to run for alderman of New York's 7th Ward in 1850. He lost his first election but was elected the following year, serving at a time when the council was not just dominated by Tammany politicians, but so known for bribes and corruption that they're referred to as the 40 Thieves. He served an undistinguished term in Congress in 1853, but preferred local politics. He rose through Tammany ranks. He was on the County Board of Supervisors, was Commissioner of Schools, and then Street Commissioner. In 1858, amid conflict with Mayor Wood over distributing city positions, Tweed was made the Grand Sachem of the New York Tammany Hall Wigwam, although most people used a different title, boss. It was a position to which he was well suited. The Bill of Rights Institute notes that he had learned how to make political allies and friends. But he had learned something else as well, the Bill of Rights Institute continues. The city's unpaved streets were strewn with trash thrown from windows and horse manure from animals pulling carriages. Black smoke clogged the air, wafted from the burning coal and wood that heated homes and powered factories. Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis thrived in the unhealthy environment. More than 1 million people were crowded into the city, many in dilapidated tenements. Poverty, illiteracy, crime, and vice were rampant problems for the poor and for the Irish and German immigrants who made up almost half the population. The city government offered a very few basic services to alleviate the suffering, and churches and private charities were often overwhelmed by the need. William Tweed discovered how to provide these services and get something in return. While the Institute notes that although Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall engaged in corrupt politics, they undoubtedly helped the immigrants and poor of the city in many ways, they also note that because New York City, like other major urban areas, often lacked basic services, the Tweed ring provided these for the price of a vote, or several votes. These voters were key to maintaining the machine's power, although the machine was not at all above wholesale cheating in elections. But Tweed also controlled appointments to lucrative political offices and city contracts, thus maintaining the loyalty of the city elite and the Democratic Party, as well as his legions of voters. His network of associates that he put into positions of power became known as the Tweed Ring. His influence extended to state politics, which allowed him to get legislation passed, growing local city authority and thus his own power. At one time, he was simultaneously serving as a state senator, New York County Democratic chairman, school commissioner, deputy street commissioner, and president of the Board of Supervisors. And Tweed would gain much in return. Political positions were usually distributed with expectations of bribes and kickbacks. City works projects, including widening Broadway, acquiring the land for the Metropolitan Museum, and beginning construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, added millions of dollars in padded costs going to Tweed and his ring. Tweed purportedly received a $60,000 kickback delivered in a carpet bag in exchange for approving the project to build the bridge. Virtually every city contractor was forced to add extra to their bills to be distributed among members of the ring if they wanted to keep their contracts. Tweed took controlling interest in a printing company and then awarded the contract for all city printing, including ballots, to his own company. Through various deals, he and his ring acquired large tracts of land, and Tweed, the son of a furniture maker, became the third largest landholder in New York. He owned a magnificent mansion on Fifth Avenue and an estate in Connecticut. He was proprietor of the Metropolitan Hotel, president of the Guardian Savings Bank, and on the board of directors of the Erie Railroad, the Brooklyn Bridge Company, the Third Avenue Railways Company, and the Harlem Gaslight Company. But the New York Landmarks Commission wrote in 1984 that Tweed Ring's greatest fraud was the new county courthouse. The construction of the courthouse started September 16, 1861. The 1974 application to place the courthouse on the National Register of Historical Places writes, in 4 years, the supervisors appropriated more than $3 million. The Tweed Ring profited from a 65% commission on each shady contract. Tweed himself owned the quarry that supplied the marble. The building was originally expected to cost $250,000 to build. By 1871, the bill for carpeting was $350,000, and most of the building was still not carpeted. The cost had expanded by then to $13 million, but the building was still not finished. The website Digital History writes that when a committee investigated why it took so long to build the courthouse, it spent $7,718, or the equivalent of $105,000 today, to print its report. And the printing, of course, was at Tweed's printing company. Historian Alexander B. Callow, Jr. unconditionally designates the building of the county courthouse a classic in the annals of American graft. Still, the Landmarks Preservation Commission writes these scandalous schemes of the Tweed ring produced surprisingly little outrage or concern from the public. The press, with the exception of the New York Times and Harper's Weekly, was unusually silent. This apparent apathy may be attributed to the fact that the ring also heavily subsidized many of the local newspapers by supplying advertisements and bribed many of the reporters directly. In the end, however, the Bill of Rights Institute notes, Boss Tweed's greed was too great and his exploitation was too brazen. While most papers were silent, the New York Times attacked Tweed in its editorials, and Harper's Weekly did via political cartoons from the artist Thomas Nast, which perhaps concerned Tweed more, as many of his voters were illiterate. But the dam began to break. In January of 1871, the ring's bookkeeper, a county auditor named James Watson, was injured in a sleigh accident. Another county auditor, Matthew O'Rourke, was brought in to review Watson's books. O'Rourke gave the figures detailing the extent of the graft to the Times, which started publishing the proof of the ring's corruption in July. The ring was broken up, and Tweed was arrested on October 27th on charges of embezzling millions. Tweed's political connections made the trial difficult. He didn't come to trial until January of 1873, where he was, ironically, tried in the still unfinished county courthouse. His first trial ended with a mistrial, the jury unable to come to a verdict, but a further trial in November convicted him on 204 counts of fraud and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 12 years, but a court of appeals reduced the sentence down to a single year, served in New York's Blackwell Island prison. It wasn't a hard stretch. Politico wrote in 2009, he maintained a semblance of the lavish lifestyle to which he had become accustomed as the city's most powerful political figure, sleeping on a springboard mattress and adorning his cell with a velvet sofa and library books. But his troubles were not over. The Landmarks Commission writes, after he was released from prison in January 1875, he was immediately arrested again on charges brought by the state, attempting to recover $6 million that he had embezzled. And that was a low number. An alderman's committee in 1877 determined that the Tweed ring had taken between $25 million and $45 million from New York City taxpayers by political corruption. Later estimates ranged as high as $200 million, the equivalent to $5 billion today. Unable to make the $3 million bail, he was held at New York's Ludlow Street jail. But again, it wasn't hard time. The New York Historical Society writes, while awaiting trial, Tweed was granted special privileges not offered to other inmates, such as a luxurious cell, catered meals, carriage rides, and home visits. On December 4th, 1875, Tweed went to visit his ailing wife at his son's home. The New York History website Inside the Apple writes, soon after arriving at the home of Madison Avenue, Tweed excused himself to go upstairs. A few minutes later, Tweed's two minders asked someone to fetch the boss as it was getting late and they needed to get back to Ludlow Street. Moments later, Tweed's son Richard came down the stairs and announced, "Father's gone." The Washington Post wrote in 2023 that Tweed had arranged to be transported in a covered wagon, and a mark on the door had been used to signal the jailbreak. Despite being described as weighing 280 pounds, he had slipped out the back unnoticed. The embarrassed sheriff, William C. Connor, offered a reward of $10,000 for his capture. He fled to New Jersey, the Washington Post notes, wearing a red wig and spectacles. Convicted in absentia, he fled to Cuba, which didn't have an extradition treaty but was recognized, and fled again, this time to Spain. The New York Times wrote, when asked about his flight, Tweed said that some friends urged him to go to Turkey or to Egypt, where the telegraph could not so easily locate him, but he finally picked Spain, hoping that in the absence of an extradition treaty, the Spanish authorities would not surrender him. However, the Bill of Rights Institute writes, because Spain's government wanted the United States to end its support for Cuban rebels, it agreed to cooperate with U.S. authorities. Spanish authorities arrested him as soon as he arrived, masquerading as a common, although notably rotund, sailor. He was identified based partly on the drawings in Nast's cartoons. Returned to Ludlow Street prison under much less favorable terms, Tweed openly testified about the corruption in Tammany Hall in the hopes that it would earn him an earlier release, but he died in his cell in 1878 at the age of 55. Tammany Hall continued to dominate New York City politics until 1950. The Washington Post notes that Tweed has since become synonymous with public corruption and unchecked greed, but of course many historians note that machine politics did bring along social development, and thus the rise, fall, incarceration, and escape of Boss Tweed truly is a saga of the Gilded Age, which was so named because, like a wooden banister that has been gilded with gold, prosperity on the surface hides corruption underneath. In a grand irony, what is now the old New York City courthouse, which wasn't finished clear until 1880, is popularly called Tweed Courthouse. When you name a public building after a city official, it's usually an honor, but of course in this case, the legacy is much more complex. So named not just because of the role that he played in the construction of the building, but because it came to represent the corruption that was done in his name. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.